Hello, hello, happy Tuesday, hope all is well. In this video, I'm going to continue my game analysis of the tournament I played a few weeks ago in Copenhagen, the Oebro New Year's tournament. In the first round, I was white, and I won a relatively clean game against an FM. And in this game, I was playing against a Danish player who I believe doesn't live in Denmark anymore, but his name was Henrik Porte, and I believe I'd played him before, but I can't say whether I was white or black, and to be frank, I didn't even remember what the lines were. But yeah, I try to take a different approach tournament to tournament anyway. And yeah, so I knew he was a D4 player, actually. That's what I did know, and I just want to continue to play relatively solid and sort of take my chances when they come. So my opponent opened with D4, my trusty weapon I know pretty well, and I played D5. And after C4, I went E6. And most of the time when you see this sort of structure, it's basically a queen's gambit declined. Typically, play might go knight f3, and then after knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, and bishop f4. And these structures are played all the time. They're a bit dull for black, in my opinion. They're a bit of a two results game, and by two results I mean usually white is playing for a win or a draw, and that's fine at the top level. Black players are happy just trying to equalize. But my opponent was lower rated than me, so I really did not have this idea in mind to go for just this absolutely boring two results game. And instead, after my opponent played knight c3, I opted for a very strange looking move, a6. And essentially the idea is just sort of to mix up the position a little bit, create a little bit of asymmetry, and right in this instant, I'm actually threatening to take the c4 pawn. So basically, the idea with a6 is actually to take the c4 pawn and then play b5 next, and just try to hold on to it. And it's remarkably direct. Now you might just say, "Oh, this a6 move is a waste of time. Why not c takes d5, and then e takes d5, and now a move like knight f3 or even a move like bishop f4 as well. And maybe this a6 move is a total waste of time, and then white can develop sort of like a tempo up in these queen's gambit, these queen's gambit exchange variations, because typically these do tend to favor white. Well, you wouldn't be totally wrong about that, but the point is that this a6 move isn't entirely useful. Typically in these structures, this is called the Carlsbad structure, where white has a pawn majority on the king side, and black has a pawn majority on the queen side. White eventually plans to develop and execute a queen side pawn storm, also known as a minority attack, and subsequent a3 and b4 might be played. So if we just make a few moves like knight f6, e3, c6, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, and then eventually, I'm just making moves. There might be a rook b1 and then knight b7 and b4. Well, typically in these structures, the minority attack is incredibly annoying, and b5 is on the cards. But this a6 move, as you can see, does make b5 a little bit harder to come by. It makes it so that white has to push a4 as well. And then after subsequent, let's just say, just making some no moves, h6, a4, rook e8, b5. The minority attack can still be very annoying, but the point is that black has some additional options because of this a6 move. For instance, black could take and then play a5 and create a passed pawn on the outside. Or black can trade an extra pair of pawns this way with a takes b5 and a takes b5, and maybe exchange a few more pawns so that he's only saddled with one weakness on c6. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this a6 move isn't totally useless. And so, in the event that white actually does take on d5 and goes for this exchange variation, it's not as bad or suspicious as it looks. Black isn't chronically behind in development, and the a6 move is a very useful move. So that's basically my sort of general summation of that. It hasn't played quite recently at the top level in the past year or so. I saw many games in the Russian Championship this year, which featured way too many draws, I might say, but with Black doing quite okay in the system. Also, Carlsen toyed around with it at the World Blitz Championship in, I believe, 2015. So, definitely not the worst move in the world. Now, White continued a little bit more ambitiously playing knight f3, and basically it offers me the pawn. So I took the pawn, d takes c4, and here White made a mistake, actually. White played a4. And typically a4 is, well, it's just a normal move. It's typically, if you play any structures with queen's pawn structures, many times after d takes c4, White plays a4 to sort of make sure that Black can't play b5, because b5 is now out of the question, because the rook would be pinned against, on a8 would be pinned against one on a1. So after a takes b5, Black couldn't actually recapture a takes b5. But here, actually, the problem is that the a4 actually chronically weakens squares on chronically weakens dark squares that are not easy to defend on the queen side, namely b4 and a5. And these matter because now, instead of just giving the pawn back or playing a normal move like knight f6, Black actually can play, and I did play, knight c6. And the idea is essentially, I can try and hold on to this pawn by just playing knight a5. And it's actually sort of annoying, because now, first things first, is in some of these lines, like in some lines of the Slav, White will try to play knight e5 to recover the pawn on c4. That's not possible here, because not only would I have the option of taking the knight, I also could take the pawn on d4. So that's not possible. I still do have the sniffle, so I have to take some tea now and then. And the other thing that isn't really, well, it's possible, e4, I could still hang on to the pawn with knight a5. And the problem is, again, this knight e5 move, not a good one, because now this knight can actually jump to b3, hitting the rook, and then eventually recapturing this pawn on d4. So it's a very tricky system, actually, and a4 is already a tiny, tiny mistake. After knight c6, my opponent played e3, and I played knight a5, covering that pawn. And now White played knight e5. And now White can recover the pawn on c4, because now I can't go knight b3, because the rook would just move, and I don't win the pawn on d4. You might ask, with this knight b3 move, well, you love the two bishops. Don't you just get the two bishops after this type of exchange? And the answer is yes, I would get the two bishops. But the problem is this bishop on c8 isn't really a real stud. So the two bishops advantage here would not be so pronounced, and it's not worth being so behind in development for the two bishops in this particular case. So knight b3 is sort of not on the cards. So I continue to develop with knight f6. And here White decided to take, knight takes c4. And here's actually the problem with the system for White, is that the bishop actually is a little bit delayed in development, because the knight is making this tour to recapture the pawn. And so Black is actually doing quite okay, because the bishop hasn't moved from f1 yet, and that, coupled with the dark square weaknesses on the queen side, means Black is doing well. And here I made a slight advantage that's difficult for to the common eye. I played knight takes c4. It's a very natural move. My knight was being attacked. You sort of like think, okay, just defend it or trade it, and I get rid of this one of the minor pieces, which is sort of important, because again, when you're lacking space, it's important to trade some minor pieces, and I am lacking a little bit of space here. And now that I trade those knights, not only do I trade a minor piece, I also trade the queen's knight for the king's knight. And that's also sort of a subtle element that's beneficial for Black, because now White has one less defender next to the king. The issue is I didn't have to rush with this capture. Instead, I could have played c5, and it would have been a little bit cleverer, because now I defend the knight with my queen, and I force white to make a decision about capturing on a5 or developing the bishop from e2, from f1, somewhere like e2. And the issue is if white develops the bishop by playing a move like bishop e2, now I could take if I want to on c4. But the point is that I've made white waste a tempo with the bishop e2 move, waste a half tempo, and I gain an extra move. So the issue is with me taking right away is that I don't actually gain this extra move, and white gets to develop from f1 to c4 in one go. So after knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, I sort of get a position that's okay, but it could have been even better if I had this extra move. So in this case, a slight inaccuracy on my part. So anyways, I played c5 now, but we could see that the position is a little bit different. And here my opponent castled, and you can see that white is a little bit ahead of development than I am. So here I played bishop d6. I thought it was a reasonable move. I didn't want to take on d4. I thought that was a little bit dangerous, because after e takes d4, I would probably play bishop e7, but now all of white's pieces are activated, and white is even now in time for d5, which could be a little bit annoying for me. In addition to moves like bishop g5, which also might be relatively natural. So I decide not, even though I would be giving white an Isolani, I thought white's piece play would be a little bit too much for me. So instead I played bishop d6, which does offer sort of a queen exchange, and white did play d takes c5. I think it is a decent decision, because if white made another move, like let's say a lazy move like bishop d2, I could take on d4, take on d4, then play queen c7, and I'm actually hitting the h2 pawn and hitting the bishop on c4. So vigilance was required on white's part. But here, after d takes c5, bishop takes c5, I did recapture the pawn. I offer a queen trade, and it's a tough decision to make. I was very willing to go to this endgame, knowing good and well that white would be a little bit better, because I think black's position is pretty solid. I thought after queen takes d8, king takes d8, I thought that, again, the weaknesses on the queen side with this b4 and a5 square, coupled with the fact that white has castled already, and the king is a little bit far, white king is a little bit far away from the action of a queenless middle game, I thought would mean that I'm okay. And so I looked at this line with e4, knight d7. It's important that I defend the e5 square, and then bishop f4, which is now threatening e5, so that if I make a lazy move like h6, e5 is played, and then I have to go king e7, and well, I have to do that before playing defending the e5 square because e6 is hanging. And then if rook fd1, I thought f6, and I've effectively covered the e5 square. That really was where my analysis was, and I thought that I'd be pretty okay here. I mean, white would have a tiny advantage, but I think I'd be quite okay playing that queenless middle game. Excuse me. And most of you guys probably do know by now that I'm quite comfortable with queen trades. So instead my opponent declined the queen trade and played queen e2, which is a tiny sort of concession in a way, because, I mean, the queen gets off the line, but I don't know, it's tough to say whether that's the best move to do. So I castled, and now white played e4, which is consistent and logical with this queen e2 plan. The plan is to play e5 and to push me back. And it's important that I defend that e5 square with real vigilance, because if I don't defend the e5 square, if I play, let's say, a lazy move like h6, then e5 comes, and then my knight is forced backward, and then all of a sudden the e4 square, the white knight has access to it, so then knight e4 comes, hitting my bishop, and now I'm in real trouble, because white all of a sudden has a wonderful space on the king side, and I don't really have many pieces around my king, so I could become susceptible to a dangerous attack. So those things were on my mind of not to do. So after e4, I played knight d7, defending the e5 square. And the point is that if white plays e5 now, I could play bishop d4 and hit against that. So if e5, I could go bishop d4, hitting the e5 pawn. And if bishop f4, defending it, I have queen c7. And the point is that if you defend the e5 pawn again with a move like rook, let's say rook e1, well, then I can actually just take on e5. Because after bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, the c4 bishop is uncovered, and I can take it back and be a pawn up and with a decent position. So that was at least what my mindset was, or my analysis was. I don't know if it's entirely correct, but I think it's decent enough. And so after knight d7, e5 wasn't played, and instead bishop f4 is played. Good move. Again, we're sort of reinforcing control of the e5 square, preparing this e5 push, but not doing it right away. It's very important I cover the e5 square, because I cannot allow this e5 and knight e4 maneuver. So now we see some jostling for that square, and here I play queen f6. And the point is to attack the bishop and simultaneously cover the square. So that after bishop g3, which was in fact played, now I can, again, cover the e5 square by playing knight e5. And it's so important I don't allow e5 and knight e4. And here it's I do a good job because I'm covering the e5 square. I'm also hitting the bishop on c4. And f4 is impossible because the bishop on c5 is pinning the f2 pawn. So in this position, my opponent played bishop b3, defending the bishop, but that was a slight inaccuracy. Slightly better, we both missed this, was actually to play queen h5 right away, hitting this knight, because now if I take the bishop on c4, unfortunately, my bishop on c5 is hanging, and it turns out this knight is really, really wanting for squares. So this would have been very unfortunate. Instead here, my only reasonable move is actually to play bishop d4. And I am holding on by a thread because I'm defending the e5 knight, defending that square, and also moving my bishop out the way. And now I'm threatening the c4 bishop. So that was really would have been a critical option. And I think I'm holding on, but white is still slightly better after a bishop move, because it's unclear whether I can hold this blockade on the e5 square for much longer. Yeah, so after knight e5, bishop d3 is played. I was happy to see that move because even though the bishop does retreat, now I get another tempo on that piece by playing knight c6. And now I'm threatening knight d4, although I'm not blocking the e5 square any longer, I'm starting to get some coordination. The only problem is my rooks aren't connected, but I thought that if I could play b6 and bishop b7 and have that coordination, I'd be okay. So I was already envisioning knight d4, b6, and bishop b7, and then maybe having something. Here, my opponent played queen h5, although one really did have to calculate e5, because now I was giving up that square, and it's a vital square, and the consequences of it could be dire. But I calculated after queen g6, bishop c2, which would be the move you want to play, is actually impossible because knight d4 is this nice tactical resource, hitting the queen and the bishop, so that after bishop takes g6, I have knight takes e2 check, knight takes e2, and then h takes g6. And I thought with the two bishops here, I should be okay. I am very nasally right now. More tea. So I thought I sort of calculated that pretty well. Yeah. So queen h5 is played, and here it's just a few moves too late. I mean, It would have been better a little bit before, because now I can play b6. And the reason I can play b6 is because my knight is not on e5 anymore, so it's not being attacked. And now I thought I was okay because I'm almost ready to play bishop b7, rook d8, and continue. Now my opponent played e5, or no, my opponent played bishop c2, excuse me, because I was threatening knight d4, and now e5 is a serious threat because it would hit my queen and threaten queen takes h7 mate. And so I decided to play queen g6, and it's actually right in the nick of time because now the pawn e4 is, or the bishop on c2 is actually pinned, or the pawn e4 is pinned because the bishop on c2 would be hanging, and I'm also hitting the queen. So if the queen retreated, let's say to a square like queen d1, I would happen to have rook d8 hitting the queen, and if the queen moves somewhere like queen c1, I'd have knight b4, and so e5 would never really come comfortably before I start to harass this bishop. So I thought I was taking a little bit over control, taking control a little bit here, because after queen g6, queen takes g6, h takes g6, I thought, now I have an ending, which is sort of what I envisioned all along. Now, you might say, oh, this is just equal, it's just equal position. It is pretty much close to equal, but the dark squares in the queen side I thought would be a real asset for me to exploit, specifically the b4 and d4 squares. I thought, as a consequence of this a4 move, I can exploit those dark squares, and that would be a huge asset for me. And it turned out it was true, because after rook a d1, I played knight b4, hitting that bishop. Knight d4 is also an option, but I opted for knight b4. And after bishop b1, which was a clear mistake because it actually makes the bishop dominated by the knight. Instead, bishop b3 would have been a little bit better. Now I have a clear sort of control on the queen side right now, and it just gives a small nagging edge. And you'll see that in the next couple moves. Bishop b7 is played. I have to connect my rooks. Rook d7 is an option here, but then I just go bishop c6, and if rook c7, I just go rook c8, and I'll eventually trade the rooks. Or sorry, maybe rook fc8 is a little bit better. Oh, rook fc8, and I eventually connect the rooks, and or I trade a pair of rooks, and I still have this pressure on the queen side. And so instead, bishop d6 was played, which is a bit clever. I mean, it's trying to trade some of the pieces that are giving me this dark square control. But now I just go rook fd8, and after bishop takes c5, b takes c5, I still have some dark square control over the d4 and b4 squares. Here my opponent played f3. It's a reasonable move, this f3 move, but I thought it would actually be better if white took on d8, and then after rook takes d8, played rook d1, just trying to trade all of the rooks before I get something really going on the queen side. I wouldn't make it totally easy, though. Instead of taking, I intended to play rook d4, which is a good move, just signaling that we try to exchange the rooks on my terms. And my idea is that if rook takes d4, c takes d4, my structure is a little bit improved, and I still have some good dark square control. You can imagine a move like this. In knight e2, I could maybe go e5, and maybe I have something here, because this bishop is dominated by the knight, and I still have some good control. This didn't happen, and after f3, I think it's a little bit of a mistake, because it allows me to, again, keep this initiative going. So I would love to keep my rooks on the board, but the problem is I can't actually really do much to move the rooks off the file until I get my king to e7, because the d7 square is could just be infiltrated by white, and you never want to allow a rook on the 7th. So here I played king f8. Here white still didn't want to trade rooks and played king f2, and then I very quickly went king e7. And I think it's also important to note here is that I did have a bit of a time advantage, which enabled me to play my moves relatively quickly while my opponent was thinking. I think it did contribute in some way to some of the imprecisions my opponent made. Ooh, more tea. So here after king a7, my opponent played king e3, and now I was really excited because now I get to keep at least one rook on the board because my king is effectively defending the d7 square. So now I thought, okay, what is the weaknesses on the queen side? It looks like it's b2. I need to get a rook, sort of thinking about attacking b2. And so I decided to play bishop c6. It's a very multi-purpose move. It moves the bishop out of the way to sort of entertain the idea of maybe putting a rook on b8. But also it keeps an eye on the a4 pawn so that the knight on c3 can't move. It's very important sometimes that, you might have a specific plan or intention, but you don't necessarily want to show it right away. And sometimes move ordering is a bit important so that you disguise your ideas. And here, bishop c6 is a multi-purpose move that does one thing that I actually want, and it does another subtler thing, and so it's effective. Here, my opponent I guess, was really keen on not trading rooks and played g3, trying to expand on the king side. But I was very open to this expansion because I figured that if white actually did go for f4, my bishop on c6 would maybe have more potential on the long diagonal. Because if you look at it a move ago before this g3 move, my bishop is pretty much doesn't have anything to do on that diagonal. And that's why it's really way more effective on the e8, a4 diagonal. So after g3, I was like, I don't know about that. Doesn't look so clean to me. And I played g5. The idea is now that I've set up this dark square bind on the queen side, I can sort of do the same on the king side. And again, just sort of try to restrict white a little bit more before going forward. It's important to improve your position on both sides of the board, sort of have like full court vision when you're playing. Now my opponent made a mistake, really egregious mistake, but maybe it's part of the time trouble, and played f4. And f4, the real problem is that white is not ready for this expansion. White definitely wants to take space, but again, the king is a little bit airy on e3, believe it or not. And when you already have weaknesses like white does have on the queen side, you don't want to create more weaknesses. And the problem is that after I take this pawn, g takes f4, any way you capture this pawn, you're actually creating another pawn island. If you play g takes f4, then the h2 pawn is isolated, and then that's 3 pawn islands now for white. And if you play king takes f4, rook takes f4, the e4 pawn is isolated. So you unnecessarily create an extra pawn island for no apparent reason. G takes f4 was played, and all of a sudden I see, oh my god, we have a target on h2. Let me take advantage of it. And I immediately switch tact and play rook h8. And amazingly enough, this position is already pretty much lost, or close to lost, because now there's an extra flank on through which I can sort of create havoc. And it's really, really difficult to defend this h2 pawn. White played rook d2, but the problem is that after this rook h3 check, which I very quickly played, the king actually can't go forward, and if it goes backward, then the h2 pawn is just lost with check. And so white played rook f3, but now the problem is that I swing the other rook over with rook a h8, and not only am I threatening to take on h2, the same problem reoccurs where if rook takes h3, I take with my rook with check, and the king has to go backward. So white's just losing a pawn. And again, I still have all these trumps on the king side. The knight is dominating the bishop. The black knight is dominating the white bishop. The black bishop on c6 is making sure the knight on c3 can't move. And so white is completely tied up from a position that seems fairly harmless. So after rook a h8, white played rook df2. But that just gives me the pawn, so I took it. Rook takes h2. And here my opponent played f5, trying, I think, to get some counterplay on my king. But again, it just creates a little bit more of a weakness. I always like to say when you move a piece, you're moving it away from squares it was previously defending. And so the way my mind works is I see this f5 move, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my god, e5 square is now weak, g5 square is now weak. And so I have more dark squares that I have access to. And it's amazing how quickly sometimes you can't take advantage of the weaknesses right away. But it's amazing how quickly you can take advantage of them sometimes. And in this case, I actually do. After rook takes f2 was played. I gave a check on h3. And my opponent, Henrik, should go back with the king. But he actually went forward with king f4. And now I started to see, oh my gosh, this king is looking mighty airy. And first I took on f5. The idea was that if, again, I'm opening up the scope of my bishop and maybe creating another isolated pawn after e takes f5 or king takes f5. And after king takes f5, this king is already very, very airy. It only has four squares right now to go to, but it's just too far advanced and it's a little naked. So I played bishop d7 check. And now that bishop d7, it controls all the squares on that diagonal, so the king only has the dark squares to go to, king f4. And then remember, a few moves ago, with that f5 move, I was thinking, oh my gosh, those dark squares, e5 and g5, are weak. And so already here I was like, if I control both of them, I'm threatening checkmate. And so I played f6, and basically the threat is g5 mate. And it's just simply a winning position. My opponent here played knight d5 check in serious time trouble. And I could just take the knight, but actually even better than taking the knight is king d6, which renews the threat of checkmate and also keeps the king close to the knight, so that the only move to get out of checkmate would be to sack the knight on f6 or to play e5. And either of those moves just hang the knight. So in this position, my opponent resigned, yeah, it was the end of a pretty interesting game, a fairly sort of innocuous, I guess, quiet-ish opening, and then a sort of tense middle game around the e5 square, and then just an ending where a queenless ending, really, with a lot of minor pieces on the board, where the dark squared weaknesses that were produced by white playing a4 really began to start to tell. And so I think sort of the main takeaways from this game would be sort of to always be mindful of the weaknesses you create when you move your piece around, but most importantly when you push your pawns, because you can't push them backwards, not checkers, right? So those really began to tell, and my patience really sort of paid off, because I didn't play sort of to checkmate. I just played to sort of just a gradual build-up, sort of in my style, and it worked out in the end. Yeah, so I was 2-0, and going into the third round, and I'll be sure to have a video on the third round soon. Thanks for watching.